Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Hello, and welcome to the Brain People Podcast. My name is Jonathan Edens. I'm a psychiatric PA, and today I am joined by one of our regular co-hosts.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Katie Cruz. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist.
And so today we'll be discussing an interesting topic, one that's been relatively new, but also not so new, and we'll discuss that. But something that's been of cultural relevance within the last few months. And so we wanted to have a little discussion today about this trend and our opinions on the matter from a professional's perspective. And so this particular trend that we're talking about today is bed rotting. Mm-hmm. So Katie, being our in-house expert, I guess, on bed rotting, why don't you tell us what are we talking about here?
Yeah, so it's an interesting term that is actually coined in a positive light, although it already maybe sounds a little bit negative. But it's this idea of laying in bed all day, doing very passive activities. So typically sleeping, scrolling on your phone, or watching movies, or doing nothing.
So where did this term become popularized? Because it's, that concept of laying in your bed, that sounds like something we've been doing for, many millennia. But this term bed rotting, it's something relatively new. Yeah.
So Gen Z, right, the young population, specifically on TikTok, is where it's been made popular. And so there's this term that's coined, bed rotting, and a lot of posts and videos. And basically it's like, it's coined and then people just ran with it. It's like, wow, that's what I do. And I think providing a term for it made it acceptable for people who are already doing it and kind of normalize that experience for them. And it's 130 plus million views and counting, right? So it's very, very popular.
So you mentioned one of the reasons potentially why it became popular because a lot of people could relate. But there's also probably, and from what I've understood, a little bit of a cultural backlash against the term and what it stands for as well. Can you maybe enlighten us a little bit with that?
Yeah. So what's interesting is if you think about, why Gen Z, right? Gen Z, the younger, generation is really pushing back on the culture of consumerism, the culture of all about work and productivity. And so pushing back on that, now sometimes I would say it's kind of like an all or nothing approach, like whenever the pendulum swings, it swings to the other side. So I can see the relevance of it in pushing back to a culture that is overemphasizing work and all work, no play. Yeah. And so there's this backlash. And it's helpful to some degree, which we'll talk about, but we can see that there's also possible dangers with it.
Are there any other ways of really describing bed rotting? I know you mentioned just kind of laying in bed all day. I've seen other terms used for this, prior to. So could you enlighten us on that?
Yeah. So vegging, that's not a new word or new term that's used, vegging or vegging out, right? Couch potato, that's probably in the negative connotation, right? And then even in other cultures, now not the exact same thing. So if you think about couch potato, think about the couch, not the bed. Vegging is a general term that's used across different, places or environments you're in. Yeah. But then other cultures have highlighted similar components. So like the Dutch culture have this word niksen, which means to do nothing. So similar kind of trends of fighting against that culture, but with different ways of approaching it.
Okay. So what might be some of the benefits of bed rotting?
Yeah. So thinking about from a perspective of overworking, right? One of the biggest and most prevalent benefits that people just keep on pushing is reduced stress, right? And self-care, That's like at the forefront of, if we were to call this like a movement, like that's the forefront, that's their banner saying like, this is for self-care, this is to rest, to decompress, and to recharge. So that those would be the main emphasis of the benefits that they talk about.
Okay. Anything else that the advocates for bed rotting tend to discuss?
Yeah. So what's interesting is if you look at the research, there's no research specific to bed rotting. And so you're really looking at principles. And so sometimes when they're advocating for bed rotting, they're really talking about the principle of rest. And so they may look at other research that talks about, for example, doing very limited activity, very simple tasks can help with creativity. So some people might argue, oh, it helps with creativity, right? You're there in bed and you're having this time and space to kind of think through things, and not just creativity from the perspective of thinking of new ideas, but also problem solving in areas, especially if you feel stuck. So again, if you think about this pushback from overproductivity, of course, if you're having a time where you can decompress, you're going to allow for the mind to have an opportunity to work on things more productively during the time of rest.
So I imagine that, you're referencing productive rest. You probably already would get some pushback even with that particular phrasing. But there's clearly some negative, or I should say some downsides to this particular approach, especially when it's not utilized in the best way. So could you give us some concerns that we, especially as mental health professionals, might have with this particular trend?
Before I jump to that, I want to mention the benefit that I think is most beneficial.
Oh, okay.
And I think for me, the most beneficial component of bed rotting, before I get into the many cons, is giving yourself permission to rest. It's choosing. So that's one of the things that I think has really caught on with this trend is because they labeled it, it's given people the liberty of doing nothing, the liberty of resting, in which maybe they didn't have before, generally from the culture at large, but also I think a fight against different generations and their different ways of thinking about life.
Gotcha.
And so I think it does a really good job at giving people permission to rest and not feel guilty. Right? I should work. We talk about the distortion of should provides a lot of pressure and guilt. And so removing that should of like, no, I don't have to. I can lay in bed. So I think just the fact alone of giving yourself permission has been really beneficial for some young people.
Okay.
And people at large, but especially for the younger generation.
So is this just a justification of bad habits? Is that what we're talking about? I mean, it sounds like it could be a good habit when used in the right way or within the right context. But before we maybe talk about that, why don't we talk about some of the downsides?
Yeah. So one of the main, if you think about bed rotting in its complete sense, right? That's where, like, we were talking about some benefits, but we're kind of piecing some parts of it away and teasing it apart. But if you look at just what bed rotting actually entails of laying in bed all day, and especially a focus on being on your phone and watching TV, watching Netflix or so forth, one of the effects of that, negative effects, would be what ends up happening is you are associating your bed, right, with lay activity, right, and not with sleep. And we recently did an episode on sleep hygiene, and we could talk about the many negative effects of just associating your bed with other activities instead of sleep. So you are negatively impacting your sleep. And that's something that a lot of people are not addressing. They're just saying, okay, you have the rest component, but you're actually feeding into the problem by not getting adequate sleep at night, and then the next day feeling more tired, and then the motivation to stay in bed is higher. Yeah. So it's not just from a place of I'm tired from overworking, now I'm tired also because I'm not sleeping adequately.
Yeah. And when in researching a little bit for this episode, I saw people discussing other more unique activities, aside from eating, but doing their nails, even cooking in some regards, playing games, right? Maybe with other friends that are coming over and hanging out, in bed. So it definitely doesn't follow the principle of keeping the bed for sleep and sex, and really only within those limitations. And so, as you said in our previous episode, we discussed the importance of that routine and those associations of sleep with your bed as a means of maintaining good quality circadian rhythm. And if that falls out of line, that's going to impair overall sleep quality, which, as we've talked about before, is one of the most important components and core principles of optimal well-being, but specifically mental health. It's often something I'm coaching with many of my depressed patients, many of my bipolar patients, that your sleep is sacred.
Yeah.
And as a result, like, your bed should be too. And the things that you do there are going to be incredibly impactful. And so, anything else you want to add about that specific concept, or any other negative things to bed rotting?
So you can think about, what it's actually doing. So that's impairing sleep, right? But also mentioning the typical activity that's done is phone or tablet or computer use. And so there's a whole nother episode, right, on screen time and the effects of screen time, especially on our mental health. And furthermore, in young people.
Yeah.
So most people, when they say, bed rotting is fine because, you're just laying there. No, most people are on their phones, tablets, and screens. And so the negative consequences to screen time and hours of screen time, because bed rotting really emphasizes like all day, right? It's being intentional about long periods of time, is you're having a lot of negative effects of the screen for a long period of time.
And what you do on the screen definitely does make a difference. Of course, if it's doom scrolling, if it's social media, if it is getting involved in content that is primarily of a negative influence on you, right? That's one thing. If it's on being on your Kindle and reading, a book, maybe it's a self-help book. I think we could probably make a little bit of an exception for something like that, even if it is maybe better to do, say, outside or on a couch or something like that, right?
Yeah. So we could add different layers to this of, even if it's the Kindle, for example, what it also does, because it's for long periods of time, is it replaces other healthy behaviors. For example, bed rotting is often very associated with isolation, right? Because you're spending a lot of time by yourself, right? It's not like a sleepover party. It's like by yourself, isolated. And then, connecting that with media use is sometimes there's a superficial sense of connection, right? I'm there, I'm talking to my friends, we're sending back and forth DMs, but you're not actually connecting in the way that's needed for a good quality of life. So isolation, lack of connection, as well as a lack of meaning and purpose, because you're not going out and about to do something meaningful, right? So again, this is really emphasizing the long periods of time, which then leads to replacing other healthy behaviors. And I know you love this topic, but it really impacts, it replaces exercise, right? And so you're not just from the perspective of, yes, regular exercise, but just from the perspective of lack of movement, right? It's a sedentary exercise or practice that is causing a lot of harm to young people as well.
Yeah, it's often said that sitting is the new smoking, right? So you could say just, instead of sitting, you could just say immobility. And so whether that's sitting, whether that's laying down for extended periods of time, beyond just what you would do for sleep, right? That's definitely, especially if done for a substantial amount of time, over many different sort of episodes, if you will, that can definitely have a cumulative negative effect on your long-term health.
Yeah, you have to think about, you are deconditioning, right?
Yeah.
Your body is meant to move. So we could do a head-to-toe scan of how it's impacting your body, right? If you think about the heart, right? If your heart is not pumping and working, you're deconditioning your heart, you're deconditioning your lungs, your body. And think about, especially this being a trend for young people, they're in the stage of development physically and cognitively. And so if physically they're not developing, and then cognitively with screens and other limited activities and not a lot of engagement and not a lot of exposure to nature and color and other stimulus, we're really limiting the mind and body's development for a young person.
As we're talking about this, I used to be a certified nurse assistant, right? And so I used to work in skilled nursing facilities and assisted living facilities and whatnot. And, there's nothing new under the sun. And so I'm just starting to think of all the patients in those facilities that have been bed rotting for very long periods of time. And, oftentimes as soon as somebody sustains a particular injury that requires them to have that as a lifestyle, their health generally tends to decompensate very, very rapidly. And so we, as medical staff in that context, one of the primary goals was constantly shifting them, getting them up when we can, right? People after surgeries, we try to get them moving as quickly as possible because that sedentary aspect is just really detrimental in so many ways.
Yeah. And then another component is, so it takes away from the opportunity of engaging in healthy behaviors, but it's often associated with also unhealthy behaviors like snacking. Right. So this is kind of where it's similar to like couch potato, right?
Sure.
It's sedentary and you're then snacking, and that can contribute to overweight. And then on top of that, we just mentioned lack of movement. So snacking is one of those unhealthy combinations. And then we mentioned screen addiction as well.
Yeah. And there's definitely a significant mental health component to this, right?
Of course.
And my assumption is that a lot of people that have latched on to the whole bed rotting craze, especially as it relates to them, are probably people that have dealt with, many of them dealt with depression, right? And so this is, something that is associated with that. I'm generally thinking of kind of the classic depression, which somebody does engage in this type of activity. And we think of like the 4 A's, anhedonia, which is a lack of interest, anergia, a lack of energy, avolition, a lack of motivation, and an apathy often as well. And so, any further comments on the mental health correlation here?
Yeah. So you mentioned depression. So I think that was a good discussion about depression. With anxiety, one reason why people do bed rotting is avoidance.
Yeah.
Avoidance of stress, avoidance of anxiety, which we know avoidance actually makes anxiety worse, right? I love, there's a quote that says something along the lines of, if you try to run away from your fear, you'll only find a shortcut to meet it. Right? It's like, that's the idea of avoidance. And another quote that I really love that says, you can avoid reality. You could avoid reality, but you can't avoid the consequences of avoiding reality. And with a lot of young people that are using bed rotting to avoid, and I should not say only young people, but general people who are using to avoid anxiety and stress will actually increase their anxiety and stress. So it becomes this vicious cycle.
Yeah, they're just kicking the can down the road, so to speak, right?
Yeah. And then I know there's another component to depression, and I'll comment on this a little bit later, but some people, they say, I'm really fatigued, right? I'm really tired. And so they want to lay down for long periods of time. And this is where some of the research that touch on bed rotting but are not directly related to that are more related to hypersomnia and other things. It's like a lot of my clients, they don't realize that they're actually feeding into the fatigue by having those extended time periods in bed.
So what are some of the other characteristics that may be important as nuance when it comes to bed rotting? Because clearly there's some good, there's some bad. So what are we supposed to take away from this?
Yeah, so I like to think about length, activity, and person, right? So the length of time. I understand the idea, and it's a good point of having rest. But really, long periods of rest, we want to find a balance. So specifically with bed rotting, we'll talk about rest in general a little bit later, but with bed rotting, you want smaller doses. Like if you do want to lay down and relax, it's good, but in smaller doses. So the length of activity should be smaller. less is more when it comes to bed rotting. And then for activity, think we already kind of alluded to this, is be intentional about what are the activities I'm going to do. And I always like to think about with activities, not just is it beneficial, but it's a cost-benefit analysis. So you may say, screen time, I do feel relaxed, but what are the potential cons, right? And so having that cost-benefit analysis for your activities and ones that can be still relaxing, right, without so many cons would be things like journaling, right? Prayer and meditation and taking a casual, very easy walk in nature, right? There's different things we can do that can be relaxing and not expending a lot of energy, which people are concerned about with bed rotting. And so I'm mentioning general activities, but some of those, obviously not the walk in nature, can be done in, I would say, the couch, not the bed.
One component of this that I know we were mentioning beforehand, before we started recording, was this idea of doing nothing, right? And so that's an interesting idea, and I wanted you to explore a little bit more about that. So, what does that exactly mean, and would that be useful? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, so doing nothing, right? It's not really possible to do nothing. Your mind will start to wander, and there's even different cultures that emphasize that, of letting your mind wander.
Yeah.
But it can be helpful because our brain is a creative organ, right? It's very artistic. And so allowing yourself just time and space to allow it to wander, which means doing nothing, can be restorative, right? Now, I like to think, I like to use this analogy of your phone, right? Of if it's charging, you're not saying that it's doing nothing. It's like, oh, this phone is being useless. You're saying, no, it's recharging. And so think about doing nothing from the perspective of you're recharging and whatever that requires. I enjoy after a long run, and even sometimes when I don't run, just laying on my back, having my legs up on the wall. And after a run, that helps with blood flow, right? But other times, if I'm really stressed, I can come home, lay on the ground, and not do anything. And typically, we don't like to do that for too long, but even doing it in microdoses helps to kind of just reset. I think this goes back to the part about pressure. Having no pressure, I'm giving myself permission to just take a brief pause in my day. And then I get up, I feel more recharged, and I continue on with my day.
I think this concept of doing nothing and allowing your mind to wander, though, especially for a lot of people that aren't used to practicing that activity, can be really challenging. And that in and of itself, just allowing your mind to wander for many people can be quite scary, especially if they deal with a lot of mental health issues. There's a well-known psychiatrist. He goes by the tag Healthy Gamer on YouTube. And one of his recommendations for some of his clients is to just stare at a wall for an hour and do nothing else. And he said it's been some of the most interesting reactions that he's gotten from that. Some people, it can kind of send them off a cliff emotionally. Other people have these really enlightening ideas. And so it's interesting because we live in a culture that's so overly stimulating all of the time that we don't have a lot of time to just sit and think in our own thoughts. And I think it's a habit that's so underdeveloped, especially with the younger generation that's been raised on having entertainment at their fingertips 24/7.
Yeah. And I think part of why that's very beneficial is because if it's part of the avoidance talk, right?
Yeah.
If you can learn to just be with yourself without any stimulation, some people talk about it's mastery of self. If you could just be with yourself and be okay. And even part of mindfulness exercise teaches you your thoughts, oh no, I don't want to be with myself. They come and go. One moment I have a mindfulness exercise that I have my clients in group write down as many thoughts as they can in the course of 3 minutes. And it's wow, I have so many thoughts. And they're so attached to some of those thoughts. And then they realize a moment later, I have different thoughts. And so learning to do nothing and be okay with it can be really empowering, for sure.
So you mentioned length, activity, and person. Can you talk about the third component there?
Yeah. So a lot of times people argue for bed rotting. They say, oh, it's for, against the culture of productivity and overworking. Well, bed rotting is most highly recommended for people who are overworking. So some of the younger generation, right, who are like, oh, I'm bed rotting, they're not having the overwork to then compensate with then overlaying. So typically for people that are overworking and then struggle with burnout, that's another big component of this, and then those who don't give themselves permission to rest. So I tell people, it's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to mental health tips.
Sure.
You have to recognize, where am I at on the spectrum? If I overwork, then you need to really work on resting more. If you overrest, you need to work on working more. And so finding that balance between work and rest is really important.
And so what we're saying, there's a lot of nuance here, depending on a variety of factors. A couple things that come to my mind, in addition to mental health conditions, there's also a lot of medical conditions as well.
Yeah.
I've got a very close family member of mine, and she struggled, with just energy levels for many, many decades of life, right? And so this is a concept she's very, very familiar with, but not necessarily wanting to live her life in that particular manner.
Yeah. So when talking about like best practice for bed rotting, is I tell people, you should start with, what is your motive for doing this?
Yeah.
And you just mentioned one of those components of, if your motive comes from, I'm actually struggling really physically, right? And I actually do need to rest, or I really cannot be very mobile. That's completely different than someone who's struggling with depression and wants to isolate and not engage in any meaningful work, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes people also, with relation to motive, maybe they don't realize, they're like, oh, I'm just bed rotting and it's okay, but they might go and have a medical evaluation. Is this related to any sort of vitamin deficiencies or low iron levels? Like, there may be a physiological condition that leads you to wanting to bed rot and not knowing there may be an underlying problem. So it depends on the motive, right? Why am I wanting to do this? Just because there's a whole social media trend that says it's okay, it doesn't mean that it's okay for you. It may be, and it may not. And then even if it is, we still recommend best practice, if you can, to do it outside the bed.
Any other best practices?
Yeah. So we talked about better activities, right? So being intentional about choosing better activities to do. And then outside of the bed, I just mentioned the two that I really want to emphasize is being mindful and intentional about your rest. So sometimes, we, with the all or nothing kind of way of thinking, we're not that intentional. Like, I go and I work, I come back home and I just want to lay in bed. Versus, how do I intentionally relax? How do I intentionally rest in a way that actually is restorative to my health, both physically and mentally? And too often, the way that we rest today is very mindless, and it actually is not very restful for us. And so if you are the person that is listening to this and said, I do need to rest, this is not, I don't want to bed rot from a perspective of just, following a trend or having an excuse, a justification for having a bad, unhealthy habit. I really want rest, then do it intentionally and mindfully.
One way of structuring your rest, especially common amongst certain religious groups, right? Especially Judeo-Christian culture has had this idea of a Sabbath. And whether you're religious or not, there's plenty of research suggesting the benefits of following a type of practice such as this. So I know this is something that you're passionate about. Could you share us some of the information regarding that, some of the research?
Yeah, so what's really important about having Sabbath rest is having a structure in place that helps with that work-rest balance. So with bed rotting, it's kind of like the spontaneous of, okay, when I feel like it, and then I might overdo it, I might underdo it. But if you have a structure in place, so this is just like a mental health tip in general, right? But really when it comes to like, okay, I work this many days of the week. And then the idea of a Sabbath is an intentional time that's set apart to say, I am going to rest on this day, right? And really having boundaries over that day, right? That time period. And what's fascinating is there's actually a research study that was released this year, and I hadn't come upon it until I was looking into this recently. And it talked about the benefits, not just of the rest itself, but anticipating the rest. And I thought that was really important because as we talk about structure, if you just say, I'll just have rest, one day a week, doesn't matter when, oftentimes life demands things that you push it off, or even if you say, I will be zealous to protect it, your brain doesn't know when it's coming. So having a set apart time really helps with, this research study specifically highlights anticipated Sabbath related to sleep quality, which is interesting. But anticipation as well as the actual day itself has led to improvements in sleep, in mental health, and just in general with quality of life, both now, and this research study was a longitudinal study that looked at the benefits even up to 4 years later.
Wow.
Yeah. And so what I often recommend to clients is, again, regardless of religious practice, this is really about, this episode emphasizing that work-rest balance. We do live in a culture that is sometimes overly emphasizing productivity and work. And I shared this with you earlier, but we forget that productivity doesn't mean work. Productivity means taking intentional steps towards a goal. And if your goal is optimizing your mental health, then it is absolutely necessary to have a work-rest balance. And as much as you can build that into your schedule so that your brain can anticipate, it's kind of, some people generally say, oh, I have the weekend, right? I'm looking forward to the weekend. But even sometimes the weekends, we don't protect enough. And we don't realize that when we don't have strict boundaries, it's so easy for things to creep in. So for me, when I celebrate the Sabbath and I protect that time, it gives me so much peace and calm that I don't have to check my emails, right? That I don't have to, open social media, and even people find me on social media and be like, can you be my therapist? So it helps me to know that time with myself, that time with my family and others is just for the intention of resting and recharging. And if I don't have that time protected, which in the past, especially grad school, I struggled with a bit, I notice the effects of my next week. It's kind of like if I don't recharge my phone, we often wait till it dies. And then you've noticed when you plug it in, right, it actually takes longer to reboot. And I think we do that with our mental health. I wait till I'm burnt out, and then I'm forced to recharge. And it takes me a while to get back. And then I'm good enough. And then I go back. And it's just this vicious cycle. And the way that society sets it up with vacation time is not enough. How do I intentionally set some time in my schedule that I can look forward to, as well as, really set some boundaries over that time so that I can productively rest?
So just out of curiosity, if you're somebody that does need maybe more than a day a week, like let's just say, for your sake, you are utilizing Friday nights to Saturdays, right, as a day of rest for you. But you're somebody that maybe struggles with a lot of mental health issues on top of that. You've got a very intense job, or you've got some medical conditions. How can you incorporate that maybe in little bits throughout the week as well?
Yeah. So let's say you have a very stressful job, right? You might budget 30 minutes, an hour after work, whether it's a commute home or it's before you get home. I had a client, a couple client, where she had a very stressful job. And so she would come home right away, and then she'd open the door, and she was anticipating all the stressors of her home life. And then immediately they'd get into a conflict. And so what we talked about is budget some time before you go home just for yourself. You recharge enough, you unwind, you recharge enough, and then go back to maybe some anticipated stressors. So you can do this, the idea of structure can be a day, can be, an hour, here and there, or even at work, right? Now we have, it's as if the world knew that we needed it. And so now it's legal, to have breaks in our schedule. Like you have to, but sometimes we choose to, our employer has to, but we choose to work through them. How do I intentionally set that time, away from my work and for just relaxation? I have some of my clients who are like, they're just on their phone. And I tell them, you're not actually resting. So if you're having a high stressful day, plan something at work that you can do to rest, to recharge. So what I recommend is kind of sprinkle in things throughout the week, but do have a bigger chunk of time that can help as a full reset, because sprinkling is not enough. Yeah. Even when people try, it's not enough. Having a bigger chunk of time to recharge, to kind of re-anchor yourself for the next week is very beneficial.
Any other research you wanted to share with us?
Well, in general, when it talks about having that day is also very helpful to reflect. So it's kind of like going back to the talk about thoughts and kind of doing nothing and letting your mind wander, is that day also helps to be very reflective. And this is one thing that therapy helps with, but if you don't have therapy, you're not really preparing yourself for the next week. How was my past week? What can I do to improve? What does my schedule look like? Some people do this on Sundays to prepare for the work week, but even just having a time that you can reflect on your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions, right? And how that can improve for the next week regrounds you to start a new week.
Awesome. Well, anything else you wanted to share with us on this controversial trend of bed rotting? Any final thoughts?
No, I would just want to encourage our listeners and our watchers to be intentional of wherever you're at on that spectrum. If you are the person that's overworking, do please take the benefit of bed rotting and, channel it into a productive way of relaxing, giving yourself permission to relax. If you fall along the continuum on the other side, maybe of doing a lot of bed rotting and you are not finding meaning in your life, you're finding yourself isolated, disconnected, find ways to get connected, find ways to find that meaning, find maybe ways to work more, but with intentionality.
Yeah, I'd also add to that, find ways maybe to get some help if you do need it.
Yes.
Obviously, a lot of our listeners are struggling with mental health issues. And if they find themselves bed rotting more than they think that they should, or more than kind of what we've discussed would be kind of a healthy aspect of it, then it might be time to consider working with a mental health professional.
Yeah.
So we want to thank you so much for everybody listening. We hope you found this informative. We realize that a lot of our listeners, this might be a new idea, as many of you we know are over 20 to 25, right? But it is an important concept to discuss. And this idea of, as you said, work, rest, balance is incredibly helpful at building a sustainable life, right? And so we hope you found this helpful, and we look forward to your listening to our next episode.
Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.